Well, good morning again. We're going to be in Luke chapter 24. We're going to be ending up in Luke chapter 24 if you want to turn there in your Bibles. So we're going to continue today talking about the story of Easter and what happened immediately after that. If you were here last week, we kind of took a short break from our Easter time just to, as we had our annual meeting and our Vision Sunday, we took some time to just look at what God had for us in the coming year. So today we're going to be kind of diving back into the story of Easter. And this is actually the first Easter sermon I've preached all year because we had a guest preacher on Easter Sunday. So that's where we're going to be. That's what we're going to be talking about. And I'll just give you the kind of the framework today. Today we're going to be kind of tackling an issue that always comes up among Christians, which is the issue of doubt. Right? This issue of how strongly are we supposed to believe? We often feel like we don't believe strongly enough, and that we should be more convinced that God is who He says He is, and more convinced that God exists, and more convinced that the gospel is true and it's a part of our lives. And this is something that I see a lot of Christians struggle with. And I see so many people, especially, that they struggle more with the fact that they have doubts than with any consequences of that doubt. So it's not like they're living these, necessarily horrible, sinful, terrible lives because of their unbelief, but we get really hung up on the unbelief itself, even if it's not necessarily impacting other things. And so it's this thing that we realize that kind of always exists in the church, but we're not sure what to do about it. And so how should we handle it? How should we manage it? And what is it supposed to look like? And that's what we're going to be looking at in Luke chapter 24. So if you pick up with me, we're going to start in verse 36 for now, and we'll bounce back a little later. But Luke 24, beginning in verse 36. As they were talking about these things, Jesus Himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. And He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when He had said this, He showed them His hands and His feet. And while they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling, He said to them, "Have you anything to eat?" They gave Him a piece of broiled fish, and He took it, and He ate it before them. So here's what's going on in the story. I'm just going to summarize what happens before it. So the beginning of chapter 24, we have the resurrection. The stone was rolled away. And there's this kind of initial viewing. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, were there, and they told the disciples, but the disciples did not believe them. The next big chunk of this chapter is the road to Emmaus. So if you don't know the story, there's two guys, they're walking down the road, and they're talking about all of the stuff that's happening. They're talking about how Jesus was crucified, but then how some of the women have claimed that He's raised from the dead. And Jesus comes up and He begins walking with them. And they don't realize it's Him, and they're just kind of perplexed because Jesus kind of acts like He doesn't know what they're talking about. And so they talk, and Jesus explains the whole situation. And it isn't until they sit down and they break bread at the table, they realize that it's Jesus. And in that moment, Jesus disappears and He's gone. At that point, those two turn around, they run back to Jerusalem, and in verse 33, they found the 11, and those who were with them gathered, and they said, "The Lord has risen indeed, and has appeared to Simon." And then they told what had happened on the road, and how He was known to them in the breaking of the bread. So here's what's interesting to me about this story, right? We have this incredible back and forth kind of flip-flop of belief and unbelief, right? And so if we look at the beginning of what we read, we look at verse 37, right? So they're in the room together. Jesus shows up. And in verse 37, we see that they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. So they're in the room. Jesus was crucified just a few days before. They haven't seen Him yet. And all of a sudden, Jesus shows up, and they're terrified because they think it's a ghost, right? Now, so far, all of this makes sense, right? They saw and heard that some of them saw, they heard the report of Jesus being killed. Interestingly enough, they didn't have any problem believing that Jesus was dead, even though most of them hadn't seen the crucifixion. But they all believe that he's dead. They all know that he's dead. He's in the grave. The stone is rolled across the entrance. They know that Jesus is dead. And all of a sudden, Jesus shows up, and they're terrified because they think he's a ghost. Now, that part makes sense, right? They knew he was dead. Now he's standing in front of us. He can't possibly be real. And that makes sense until you go back to verses 34 and 35. Look at the language that we see in verse 34. The disciples are there saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And so just 2 verses before they're terrified, before they think he's a ghost, they are convinced that Jesus has risen from the dead. Right? And so they're convinced. They're using this very positive, very affirming language to say, yes, he has risen indeed. This language that is stuck through the church for thousands of years, and we often repeat on Easter, and we say he is risen, and we say he is risen indeed. It's this very positive, very affirming, very strong, like this did in fact happen. Right? And then 2 verses later, after they say, he is in fact, he is indeed, he is risen. We know it happened. We're sure it happened. We're talking about it like we're sure it happened. Jesus shows up, and they think he's a ghost. They can't handle it. And for whatever reason, which doesn't make any sense, they think he's a ghost. So they, in one verse, believe he's risen, know he's risen, are talking about him being risen, and then all of a sudden, the risen Jesus shows up, and they just assume that he's fake. They assume that he's a ghost. And so what we have here is this story that just doesn't make sense. It's like, do you guys believe that Jesus is real? Do you believe that he's risen? Or do you not believe that he's risen? It's really, really ambiguous. And they go back and forth. And really, I think a lot of us can identify with that. Right? Like there are days when we are like, I know that God exists, that he is real, that he loves me, that the Bible is the inspired word of God that teaches me how to live and shows me how to relate to God. And we are just so positive. We are so sure of what we believe. Where's that even coming from? Oh. Jacob. He's not even here. Sorry about that. I don't know why I went to that. So we have days where we are so sure, right? Like where we just know that we're Christians. We know that God exists. We're so positive. And then sometimes you wake up the next morning, right? And you just have no idea. Right? How many people can relate to the disciples in this a little bit? Like you don't have to raise your hand, but you can if you want to. But think about it, right? A lot of you are like really smiling at me so nobody else sees, but I can see your smiles. Because we relate to this. Like on Monday, we're just like, I am so sure in the resurrection, and I'm so positive about my faith. And then Tuesday shows up, and we're just like, well, maybe he's just fake. Right? Maybe Jesus is just a ghost. Maybe he's just made up. Maybe it's this kind of figment of our imagination. Like, did I really feel the stuff that I felt? Did that change really happen? Maybe that was just a really emotional night for me. Right? We look back at these moments in our spiritual walk when God did things. It's like, man, and we basically say, well, maybe that was a ghost. Right? Maybe I was just really overwhelmed that night. Maybe what I was feeling was just the moment and the spirit of what was going on and the people around me. And we basically do the same thing where one day we're like, I know that God exists. I know that he's risen. I know that he's real. And then the next day, we 100% echo what the disciples do. And we're just like, maybe he's just a ghost. Right? Maybe it's all a figment of our imagination. Maybe it's not really real. Maybe he's not really tangible. Maybe God's not really interacting with our world in concrete ways. It's a really fascinating verse, though, in the middle of all of this. Verse 41, and all of the translations translate this a little bit differently. I love them all. This is a great verse to go home if you've got multiple Bibles at home and read through it in different translations. But mine says, and while they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling, he said to them, have you anything to eat? I mean, this verse just makes the whole thing more confusing, right? I mean, look at the three things that the disciples are doing. They're disbelieving, they're joyful, and they're marveling. Right? They're not believing, they're having trouble believing, but they're also filled with joy, and they're also just like, this is the idea, like their minds are blown, right? Just like they just don't know what to do with it. Let me tell you a story. I might have told this one before. If I ever tell stories twice, then tell me, and I'm going to start putting sticky notes in my office. When I was younger, we moved up to Vermont when I was almost 9 years old. And before we moved, I sold a bunch of my toys and had some money. And then when we got to Vermont, I just worked and worked and worked as much as a 9-year-old can. It was probably like an hour a day, even if it felt like 40. But I worked and I saved and I set my money away. And I think it was that first winter that we lived up here. I don't really know. Yeah? Okay. The first winter we were up in Vermont, as a 9-year-old kid, I bought myself a snowmobile. Now, first of all, this is a demonstration of what I say to everybody who moves to Vermont. So if you've moved to Vermont recently, and I know there's a couple of you here, you gotta find something to do in the winter, right? Find something that you love to do. If it's snowmobiling, if it's snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, I don't care. I mean, those are some of the things that I've done, but find something to do, or else it's going to be a really long time of year, as you're seeing. So when I was 9 years old, I saved up, and I saved up, and I saved up, and I bought myself a snowmobile, and it was this like 1976 bright orange Motoski 250. I mean, I got really, really good at pulling that pull cord over and over and over. But I had a ton of fun with it, and I would just go drive in circles around the field. And so I had that. I bought that for myself in 4th grade. So I drove it all my 4th grade year, and it was awesome. And I drove it 5th grade year, and it was still pretty great. In 6th grade year, I was starting to get a little bit big. And then 7th grade, it was definitely like I could throw the thing around too much, and it wasn't really doing it for me. But at that time, I didn't really have any money. I couldn't do anything else. And one day, my dad and I went to a friend's house, a family friend. And they were snowmobile people. They had their garage painted to match their snowmobiles and left their cars outside kind of thing. And so we were there, and we were just hanging out and having fun. And we were getting ready to leave, and my dad said, "Hey, you should go sit on that snowmobile over there." And I was like, no, I don't really want to. I said, no, you should really do it. And I really would not do it. And what was happening in my mind was I was looking at that snowmobile saying, man, it would be so amazing to have something like that. Like, it would just be, like, I can't even comprehend how great it would be to have that. But I also knew that we really didn't have a lot of money. And at that time, we didn't have a lot of extra money. And, we didn't have extra stuff at that point in time in our lives. And, I knew that my parents needed to get a new car, and I knew I didn't have any money. And so I knew that it wasn't going to happen. And I didn't even want to sit on it because I knew it couldn't happen for me. So I refused. My dad wasn't happy because I was directly disobeying him, which is probably fair. We went home, and it was funny. My dad didn't actually say anything to me. My mom came into the room, and she wasn't happy with me. And she said, "Your dad just bought it for you, and he wanted to tell you with you sitting on it." I couldn't even comprehend that. The possibility to me was just beyond comprehension, right? And we're not going to get off track with this but so often this is how we relate to God, right? Where we just say it's not going to happen. All right, the biggest place this happens, the number one and the most important, the most crucial, the worst time for this to happen is when we say, "God, you cannot love me." Right? Because I looked at my life, and I knew how much money we had, and I knew where we were at. I mean, I didn't know how much my parents made, but I knew that we were not people who had lots of extra money to go buy a wicked nice toy for their 7th grade kid. And I didn't want that. And I knew that my reality told me that couldn't happen. And so many people, your reality tells you that nobody can love you. Right? There are so many people in our world that their reality, everything that has happened up until now, says you're not going to get that. You're not going to get accepted. You're not going to get loved. Because that's what we do. We look at what we've had in life and we use it to judge what's going forward. But the problem is, like I was, sometimes we're wrong. And we're almost always wrong when it comes to God. Because there are so many people that they look at their past, they say, I thought this person loved me. And then they bailed. And I thought this person loved me, and then they bailed. And then I thought this person that was never supposed to leave me, even they bailed. I've been in relationships, I've been in families, and I wasn't lovable enough to keep any of those together, right? There are people in our world, and maybe you struggle with this too. There's a good chance some of you struggle with this, that we just say, man, I am not lovable enough. Right? It just can't be done. Nobody's ever loved me. Nobody's ever been there for me. Nobody's ever laid themselves down and put me before them. It is not going to happen. Why should God be any different? We say, God, there's just no way it's going to happen. My reality is that people don't love me. And sometimes we say, and you know what? I understand why. And maybe when I was 5, I didn't understand why people didn't love me. But at this point in my life, I'm broken, I'm messed up, I'm a bad person, I've done a lot of bad stuff in my life. And we say, God, I get it. I'm not even going to ask you to forgive me because, I get it. You're not going to be able to do it. Nobody loves me. That's my reality. And hey, I'm okay with that. Because God's love is just so over the top. You've probably seen this principle elsewhere. If you're the kind of person that loves to watch compilation videos online where they show a bunch of the same thing over and over and over, I've watched. It's not my favorite, but I've seen compilations of kids being told that they're going to Disney World. Anybody ever seen a video like that of just 30 different sets of families telling their kids that they're going to Disney World? It's amazing because you look at the reactions of these kids, and more often than not, you know what they say? They don't say, yes, I knew it. At least not the ones in the video. You know what they say? The kids that really appreciate it, the kids that really didn't expect it, you know what they say when mom and dad say, kids, we're going to Disney World? You know what the number one thing kids say in that situation is? No, we're not. Right? No, we're not going to Disney World, right? Because to those kids, that idea is just so far beyond what they expect, so far beyond what they can even comprehend, that they just say, no, we're not doing that, right? And so this is what happens in our lives, that we have no problem believing things that are easy to believe, right? I was talking to the worship team this morning, and I said, you know what? If Jason came up to me and before church and said, hey, you helped me out with something last week, or I was just, for whatever reason, I just want to give you $20, right? If Jason walked up to me and said, hey, I want to give you $20, I would respond something like, oh, well, it's really nice of you. I really appreciate that, Jason, right? Like that's a nice gesture, and I don't know if I'd take it or not. Probably depending on why he said he was giving it to me. But if Jason walked up to me and said, hey, I want to give you $20, I'd say, man, I really appreciate that, right? On the other hand, if Jason walked up to me and said, Eddie, I want to give you $20,000 cash, you know what my reaction would probably be? No, you're not giving me $20,000 cash, right? Because the first one's believable. I know that Jason's got $20. He could walk up and hand me $20. And that would make sense. I don't know that I've done anything to deserve that or not, but maybe I was nice to him or what. He just wants to do it. I can believe that, and so I would accept it, no problem. If Jason walks up to me and says he wants to give me $20,000, I tell you what, it's going to be 4 days later. I'm going to be looking at the money and be like, no, right? He didn't really give me this money. This money's fake. This can't be real. It wouldn't, well, see, because it's unbelievable. So, when my wife told me she was pregnant for the first time, maybe not the second time, it was a little more believable the second time. When my wife told me that we were pregnant for the first time, right, that was my reaction, no, you're joking, we can't really be pregnant. And obviously, logically, I knew that we could be pregnant, and I get how that works, but that was my reaction, no. We can't possibly be pregnant. Like that, something that great can't possibly have happened to us. And so we see this all the time. This happens in marriage proposals. I'd rather watch the marriage proposal videos than the kids going to Disney World personally. But there's that moment of like, I cannot believe that this is actually happening. And so this is what we see in the disciples in verse 41. They were disbelieving for joy, and they were marveling. Because what happened in them was that Jesus just shows up, and they're just completely overwhelmed. Like, they don't even understand how it could, like, first of all, like, the science and the logistics of, like, you were dead, and people that die stay that way. That's the way the world works, right? Like this is our understanding. This is what we've seen. This is what we know for thousands of years. People that die stay dead. How could you not be? So, like, logically, it's just mind-blowing to them. And then in every other way, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, right? This guy came in and changed their lives, changed everything about how they view the world and the way they interact with the world. He changed all of that. And then all of a sudden, he's gone. And they're just left with this giant empty hole in their lives. And then all of a sudden, Jesus just comes back and shows up. And I cannot imagine just like the emotional trauma of this for the disciples, right? Like, things are amazing, and then they're awful, but then there's hope again. And they're so overwhelmed that they just can't even believe it. Like, it's like short-circuiting their brains. And so they're in this place where they are disbelieving for joy. Right? Now, that's not a cause that we often associate with disbelief, right? When we look at ourselves, when we look at our own disbelief, what are the things that we associate with that? We associate sin, right? Like, oh, I'm so sinful that I'm having trouble believing in God. We associate weakness, right? I disbelieve because of my weakness. We say, I disbelieve because I don't understand well enough. We have all of these things. Fill in the blank for yourself, but we have all of these causes of our disbelief, right? I disbelieve because I just don't have enough faith. I have disbelief because I'm not trying hard enough. I have disbelief because I'm a bad person. But that's the complete opposite of what we see here, right? It says that they were disbelieving because of their joy, which is a fruit of the Spirit, we find out later. Right? And so joy is universally, like, that is from God. Joy comes from God. And so this thing that was given to them by God caused their disbelief. How much would it change your life if you began to see the disbelief in your hearts as an outcome of what God is doing in you rather than a result of you messing things up in your life? Here's the bottom line, church. It's really easy to believe in things that don't matter. It's really easy to believe in things that are easy to understand. It's really easy to believe in things that don't mean much. But the gospel is so much bigger than that. The gospel is so much more powerful. It is so much more amazing. The gospel is just a hair away from being too good to be true. It's so close to being too good to be true, but it's definitely too good to comprehend. So here's what I want us to think about. Maybe we need to stop running away from our unbelief. One of the biggest red flags that I see when I'm talking to Christians, this is typically something I see in newer Christians, or maybe people that have been Christians for a long time, kind of nominally, and then kind of had a big, revival or something like that. But one of the things that scares me when I see Christians, right, is the Christians that never talk about doubt. What scares me more than anything else is the Christians who act like they know everything, that they know that the Bible's true, that they know that God exists, that they just, like, everything is just completely and fundamentally, like, there's never any doubt in their language. There's never any kind of anxiety. There's never any tension there, right? Like, oh yeah, of course God exists. Nothing scares me in a Christian more than that. You know why? It's because the only time you can be that sure about something is when it's something simple, when it's something basic, and when it's something that's not really all that valuable. Right? Going back to the money example. Somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I'm going to give you $5 tomorrow. I'm going to believe that. Right? Like that's believable. But if somebody says I'm giving you 20 grand tomorrow, I'm going to doubt that. I am going to wonder if it's really happening up until the moment it happens. Right? I didn't believe my wedding was happening until after it happened. Right? Like in my head, there was no possible way I was marrying someone as amazing as my wife. And so like in my head, I was pretty convinced that I was just going to show up to the altar and that some like inferior model was going to show up, right? Oh, sweetie pie, did she want to come up? Oh, juice is important. Right, so when I was preparing to go into my wedding, I was half convinced in my mind that I wasn't actually going to get to marry Rachel, because how could that possibly happen to me? And it took getting married, having the ceremony, and who even knows how long afterwards that it finally clicked that, yeah, this is actually going to happen. And so this is why one of the most terrifying things in Christians to me is people that claim and act like they absolutely know everything in the faith. Because first of all, the disciples didn't do that. All right? They went and they preached boldly. Like they preached the gospel and they were outspoken about the gospel. And, I'm not saying that like, Peter got up and preached and he didn't say like, Jesus is raised from the dead, probably. Like they preached boldly. But even throughout the entirety of the New Testament, they had struggles and they wrestled with things and they were like, God, what are you doing? I don't know what your plan is. It's easy to believe in things that don't matter. But we have to recognize that with how big our God is, how amazing the message of the gospel is, that we can't, if we comprehend what's actually happening in our faith to any degree, there will inherently be doubt and disbelief because of our joy. Right? So here's the two things that we need to come out of this hearing. All right? The first one is that disbelief is a part of our faith, right? Because of how big God is, because of how amazing God is, that we are going to have this tension in our lives, right? Where we're just trying to say, can this possibly be true? And I want to wake up every single morning being like, man, God, do you really still love me? Like, we really made it another day? How does that happen? How can you possibly do that? We need to allow for that. And the second thing is to ensure that our disbelief is coming from joy, right? And identifying that if we're going to have this disbelief, realizing where it comes from and realizing that that's not a bad thing, because then we can celebrate it, right? And then it's not a matter of like, well, I'm just not sure where I'm at in my faith right now. It's not about like, I don't know if I'm good enough, right? Like I don't feel like I'm believing in God enough. Does that mean I'm a bad Christian? That's not the point where our belief should take us, right? If somebody, when I was coming up to my wedding and I was like, I don't think this can happen. This can't possibly be happening. This has got to be a dream. She's got to be a ghost or a robot or something. But I cannot possibly be marrying this. Like, why on earth would she want to live with me for the next 60 years? That doesn't make any sense. But my reaction wasn't to like lock myself in the room and be like, I'm a terrible person because I'm not convinced that Rachel wants to be with me. I just went out and told people about it, right? Like, how's your life going? I'm getting married in 3 weeks. You excited about it? Just a little bit. Doesn't make any sense. I don't know why she's marrying me. She's the most incredible person and she's amazing and she's wonderful. And we're going to cut this out of the video before I show it to her. But she's just amazing. And I don't have any idea why she's marrying me. But she is. That kind of disbelief is powerful. And that's the kind of disbelief that God calls us to have. Let's pray. Jesus, God, I want to thank you this morning for loving somebody like me and loving somebody that's a mess and that has issues and that does the wrong thing and says the wrong thing. And God, I just want to thank you for loving me, because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that you wouldn't have given up on me a long time ago. It doesn't make any sense that you're still chasing me down, that you're still loving me, that you're still healing me, that you're still taking care of me. But God, that's what you do. And I don't get it. I don't know why. I don't understand why you're in my life. I don't understand why you want to be a part of my life. But God, I thank you that you are. And so God, as I go out into the world, God, I want to wake up every morning and I want to pray for one. I want to say, God, give me one person today to show how ridiculous your love is. Give me one person today that I can do something for them that they will just say, man, that didn't make any sense. Why did you do that for me? And I can just say to them, look, I have a God who does things for me that doesn't make any sense. I have a God who loves me in a way that doesn't make any sense. And I just thought that you should be a part of that. I thought that you should get in on that. That you should know what it feels like to be loved. No strings attached, no commitments, no nothing. Just I thought that it would be good for you to be loved the way God loves me. And so God, maybe we be a church that does things that don't make sense. Maybe we be a church that goes above and beyond in pouring our love out on other people. Maybe we be a church that makes people scratch their heads because they just can't figure out why and how we do the things that we do. Let us be your people. Open doors and let us love. We love you, Lord, and we ask these things in your name. Amen.